Did you guys ever watch MacGyver? Yeah? What a great show. For those of you who may not have watched it, the kind of the shtick of this show is that the main character, he's a secret agent, but he's nonviolent. He refused to carry a gun, and he tried to find alternate ways to solve his problems. And the show was actually kind of a response to the gratuitous action heroes of the early 80s, right, like Rambo, who solved every problem they encountered with an endless stream of gunfire from their automatic weapon of choice, right? So how did MacGyver get around problems if he couldn't just shoot his way through any situation? Well, his whole thing was that he was extremely resourceful, right? He could solve any problem, no matter how big, if he just had a number 2 pencil, a paper clip, and an 8-inch strip of masking tape, right? And he was so interesting because he wasn't like James Bond with a whole team of scientists pouring millions of dollars into research and development so he could have fancy gadgets and cars, but rather he could accomplish his objectives with any of the resources that he had at his fingertips, no matter how humble those resources may be. Now, what if there was an episode where MacGyver, instead of having to dig around and find a bunch of stuff and build something to make it work, what if he just found everything that he needed in an episode, right? He's locked in a jail cell, he needs to escape, he's looking around for something he can use to pick the lock, and he flips over the corner of his mattress and there's a key there. And he tries it out and it opens the cell door, and then he finds that he goes out and the guard was drugged already. He's asleep in his chair, right? And then he sees some guards outside the main entrance, so he decides to check the window, and there's a ladder outside the window. He might start to think that maybe somebody knew he was going to be in that situation and had set up in advance a way for him to escape, right? He might be able to put the pieces together that he's not alone in this, and that he's been, even though he hasn't been directly contacted by anyone, that someone is clearly interested in his mission and has been offering him assistance from a distance, right? In our passage today, we're going to see a situation where God foresaw trouble that was on the way and had set up resources and means to deal with the problem in advance, and all that the main characters, Esther and Mordecai, had to do was step into it, to step into his will and to use what they had at hand to accomplish what God had for them. We've been working through this series that I've called Present in Providence, where we look at the books of Ruth and Esther and see how God is present in these books, despite the fact that he's not mentioned. There's no record of him explicitly acting or telling people how to act. But we see his fingerprint on everything that happens throughout these stories. And it's a good way for us to learn how to see God's hand at work in our own lives. Our last message in this series showed how acting justly and with godly character is important even more when you're among people who are not just or godly. Right? We talked about how even in the worst situations, God is there with you, and he can use your faithful actions on his behalf to accomplish good things beyond our understanding. Today, we're looking at the way that we can see God's hand of providence at work and how we can add our efforts to his. Our passage today begins in Esther chapter 3, if you want to turn there with me. And if you recall with me in our last message in this series, we talked about King Xerxes. We learned about who he was as a person, that he was endlessly partying, how he was flippantly making new laws and for silly reasons, and how he's not the most responsible of leaders. And we saw the situation where Vashti, the queen, refused to appear before him and his drunken friends, and how Xerxes immediately followed the advice of his advisors and banished her from his presence. This led to them running a season of The Bachelor so that they could find a new queen, right? And it turned out that the new queen was this girl named Esther, who then immediately helped prevent a plot to assassinate the king through the help of her adopted father, Mordecai. So that's our quick recap. That's where we're at. They've just prevented this plot. And now we find ourselves in chapter 3. Our passage today begins by introducing us to this sinister fellow, Haman the Agagite. Right? And you might be wondering, what is an Agagite? Other than a strange combination of syllables. For whatever reason, Haman had gained great favor with Xerxes. The author doesn't tell us why, but Xerxes liked this guy. And so Xerxes placed Haman in a higher status than any other noble, to the point where the king instructed, he made a law that everyone who saw Haman had to bow down when Haman passed by him, or by them. And most people obeyed this, but our friend Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. Now, the author does not directly explain to us why Mordecai refused to bow, but the implication seems to be a matter of ethnic pride. You see, Mordecai is identified clearly as Mordecai the Jew, and Haman, clearly identified as Haman the Agagite. So there's a lot of history between these two people. The author seems to be implying that Mordecai will not bow because the pride that he has in his people, the Jews. So we have to remember that the only perfect human that we encounter in the Bible is Jesus, right? And even good and solid characters like Mordecai make mistakes. He wasn't perfect, right? And he let his pride get in the way here, and it caused some serious troubles, right? I think this was a mistake from Mordecai. People could debate it, but this wasn't like Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He wasn't being told to worship false gods. Frankly, he probably bowed down to the king, to Xerxes. Mordecai probably, it was likely Mordecai's pride in his ethnicity that caused him to disobey in this instance, which led to Haman learning about Mordecai's ethnicity and determining that it wouldn't be enough for him to just punish Mordecai. I think I missed a part in there. So the Agagites were King Agag, was the king of the Amalekites. If you read in 2 Samuel, I think I put it in the slide, but I didn't put it in here. That's what happened. If you read in 2 Samuel, the Agagites were the mortal enemies of the Israelites. So King Agag went to war against the Israelites. Saul defeated them and shamed them, but ever since the book of Numbers, there's this clash that happens in the book of Numbers between Israel and the Amalekites, and that enmity continues on all throughout the history of Israel. And now we've reached this point where both peoples have been subjugated by Persia, and these two figures, Mordecai and Haman, have ended up in the royal court of Persia, and the enmity continues. Mordecai won't bow to Haman because he's an Amalekite, and they hate Amalekites, right? And Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and he says, okay, I'm not just going to kill Mordecai for not bowing to me. He decides, I'm actually going to kill every person from his race. And so he hatches this scheme. He begins by casting the dice, right? He cast lots, which were essentially dice in the ancient world, to pick the date that he was going to execute his plan on. And this shows you kind of the malice, the flippancy with which he is approaching this task, right? He decides he's just going to pick the day that he's going to do it by rolling the dice, because he cares so little about their lives, right? And he's so confident in his power over them. And so the lot lands on the 12th month, almost a year away from his current time. They were currently in the first month of the year, so we would call it January. And so there's actually, it ends up, there's actually a fair amount of time for our protagonists, Esther and Mordecai, to figure out a solution to this problem. It's not like he decides he's going to kill them all, and then the next day he's going to go forward with his plan. And we can say, wow, what a lucky coincidence. How lucky are they that it landed on the last month of the year instead of the first month of the year? But I want to remind you of Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33, which says, "We may throw the dice, but the Lord determines how they fall." Isn't that a poignant verse to think of in this passage? It wasn't chance that made those dice land on the 12th month of the year. We can see God's fingerprints on that. We can see his providence at work there we don't need anyone to explicitly point it out, but we need to keep our eyes open for those little details where God's mercy is providing a way through those troubles. So Haman casts his lots, and then he appears before the king to make his request in verse 8. He says this, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." So once again, we're seeing Xerxes' irresponsibility with his power at work here. At no point is he like, "Who are these people?" Doesn't bother asking that question. He doesn't say, "Oh, what laws are they breaking? What laws are they ignoring that we should punish them so?" No, doesn't ask anything. Instead, he takes the royal signet ring, the symbol of his power and authority, and he gives it to Haman, right? This is a very irresponsible ruler. And remember what I said about the dangers of being a displaced people in a nation where the powerful pass legislation on a whim. Remember, and when the king of Persia passed legislation, it could not be undone. He could not undo any law that he passed. And now we see the fruit of that. Right? We see the fruit of that flippancy that he has with his power. And so a dispatch is sent out, and as we see in verse 12, then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So at this point in the story, things are not looking good for the people of Israel. But I think there's a little bit of hope tucked in with this parcel of bad news. Did you notice the day that those scribes were sent out, that those edicts were sent out? The author notes it very clearly. He says, the dispatch was sent on the 13th day of the first month. Now, does anybody know what was supposed to happen around that time on the Jewish calendar? Well, the 14th day of the Jewish month was Passover. Isn't that interesting? The day before Passover. What do you think God was communicating to them there? Right? The commemoration of God delivering the Israelites from the clutches of Pharaoh in Egypt, where once again they had undergone genocide and slavery. Right? A rather auspicious day to have such a thing delivered. I think once again we see God's subtle hand at work reminding his people that he is active and that he's delivered them before, and deliverance is on the way. Now, as we turn the page over to chapter 4 of Esther, we see that the Passover festival has turned from celebration to mourning, as Mordecai and the Jews all across Persia clothed themselves in sackcloth and ashes, and then they began fasting and weeping and wailing. Now, eventually, Esther's attendants learned about her adopted father Mordecai being in a state of mourning. He wasn't allowed to enter into the king's court because he was wearing sackcloth. That wouldn't be allowed. And so she sent some of her attendants out with clothes so they could clothe him and bring him into her so she could talk to him and find out. But he refused to put on those garments. So his pride that we saw earlier that prevented him from bowing to Haman and actually led to this whole mess, he's abandoned that pride now. And now he won't even put on proper clothes. He refuses to put on the clothes that she brings him. So he's humbled himself, right? His pride led to this, but he's had the proper response. He's repented of that, and now he's wearing his sackcloth. But he wouldn't accept the clothes, so she sent a trusted eunuch to go out and ask Mordecai why he was in such a state. And Mordecai explained everything to this eunuch, including the amount of money that Haman was using to bribe the king, right? Which tells us that Mordecai was once again privy to secrets within the king's court, right? That information was not included in the edict that was sent out. And then Mordecai even sent a copy of the decree back with the eunuch to give to Esther so she could see with her own eyes what was being done. And then we see that he orders her to go and talk to the king, which is odd for him to be ordering the queen around. But we have to remember that he's her dad, right? He has that authority as her father, and he chooses to exercise that now, right? And he orders her to go to the king and beg for mercy on behalf of their people. So Esther responds with this message to Mordecai. She says, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the golden scepter toward them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." Right, so she's telling him, she's like, I'm out of favor. The king hasn't talked to me for 30 days. And she's like, and if I just show up there, I could die. Right? And so she's not saying no, but she's saying like, look, the chances are slim here. I might not even get to talk to him. And so she's acknowledging he's asking her to do something perilous. And she wasn't sure of the right path forward. But Mordecai was kind of pulling a MacGyver in this moment, right? He was looking at the resources that they had available, slim though they may be. And he was just distressed, but he saw that actually they had the right resources and tools in place for this situation. He saw that something else was at work that was not immediately visible. So he responded to her with this statement: "Do not think that because you're in the king's house that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." So Mordecai wasn't just scolding her and saying, hey, what good is your position if you don't use it? Rather, I think he's encouraging her. He's saying, if God had put her in position for this time, do you think he's just going to let you die? Do you think you're going to go into Xerxes' presence and he's just going to kill you? No. Would he not assure her success if she used the position that God had given her to do the will of God? It's like if God has given you all the tools you need to do the job, and the job is clearly within the scope of God's will, don't you think he's going to provide everything else that you might need to get that job done? And Mordecai has this remarkable confidence in God. He understands God doesn't need you, Esther. Right? We're not in this position where God's not going to accomplish his will if you don't do this. Right? If you don't do it, God's going to bring salvation from somewhere else. But you're going to lose out on it. Right? So finally, Esther responds by saying, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So she's obviously still nervous about her course of action, which is fair, but she has chosen to go forward with the plan. Her words, "If I perish, I perish," might seem like she's simply resigned to her inevitable death. Right? But I think instead it shows her steadfast courage. Right? She knows that death is on the table. But she's going to go ahead with it. She's going to go ahead with the plan, even if it means she could die. And so we see hope in the midst of Haman's psychotic mission of genocide. Hope that God has a way through the waters for his people. Mordecai saw that hope, and Esther has embraced it and courageously walked towards it. Next week, we'll see what plan Esther hatches out of that. But for now, I want to really focus in on how we see Esther and Mordecai navigating the will of God when neither of them have heard an audible voice from God or had a prophet approach them with a word from God. Right? Neither of them had just this voice that told them what to do. And so I feel like we can really identify with that. They were in a bad situation, a tough situation, but they were able to figure out what God wanted them to do, even though no prophet popped up to say, "Hey, do this." And that's much more akin to the experience that we have, isn't it? Now, they looked at the problem in front of them. They looked at the resources at their disposal, and that helped them figure out how to proceed because they understood what God wanted for them. God wanted to sustain his people. They knew that. Right? Remember in our last message, I talked about what Jeremiah the prophet had told them, that God had good plans for them, that he was going to bring them out of exile one day, right? That he was going to bring them back home. So they knew this wasn't the end for them. And so they saw how they should proceed. They knew that as the beloved queen to Xerxes, Esther had unique access to him that nobody else in the whole kingdom had. She didn't have power to make legislation. She didn't have power to change legislation. She didn't even have the power to enter his presence whenever she wanted. But she had a special relationship with him that nobody else had. And you might be thinking, well, I'm not a queen. I don't have special connections to rulers. I don't have those resources available to me. And that's true, but that doesn't mean you have no resources. If nothing else, you have control over your body and your mind. Even if Esther was the only one that had to walk into the presence of the king, the whole congregation of Israel in Susa had joined her in fasting and prayer leading up to her action, right? They had the power over their own bodies to choose not to take in food, to focus their minds and their mental energy on praying to God on her behalf. Mordecai may not have had access to the king, but he had access to the queen. And he used his clothing and his outward appearance, the change in his attitude, his humility, to get her attention so he could convey the information that God had somehow miraculously provided to him. Do you see how they were using what was available to them? Right? In the parable of the talents that we see in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus tells about a king going on a journey and how before he leaves, he goes to each of his servants and he puts them in charge of a portion of his estate. Some were given great portions and others were given little portions. But what was important at the end of the parable was how they used what had been portioned to them. Jesus has given each one of us resources to use for his kingdom while he is away. Right? Some of us have been given great resources and some have been given meager. Right? And for fear that we might be like the third servant with the smallest portion who just hid his portion away to make sure that he didn't lose any of that, and that condemns him in the end. But Jesus has called us to be like MacGyver with what he has given us. Right? Even if we only have a few paper clips and a few strips of tape under our watch that God has given us, we might look at them and think, how can I possibly make anything out of this? This is nothing. But thankfully, we have a good promise from God. Right? His promise doesn't require us to be a genius and to make something amazing out of that little thing, to understand how to make it. But rather, his promise is that if we take what we have and we use it for his kingdom and his glory, then he's going to take the effort that we put into that and he's going to multiply it 30, 60, and 100 times. Right? That he's going to use it for his glory and he's going to establish the effort that we have and cause it to bear fruit. In 2 Corinthians 9, verse 8, Paul said, "And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work." Right? No matter how little you have, if you put it towards God's kingdom, he's going to grow it and multiply it and make good things with it. And like that encouragement that Mordecai was giving to Esther, if God wasn't going to help you the rest of the way, why would he have put you in the position you're in? Why would he have given you what you have if he wasn't going to use it to build his kingdom and his glory? So my prayer is that God would give each of us eyes to see the resources that he's put in our care, and wisdom to understand how to use them, and to identify the situations in which we can use them in our workplace, in our families, in our society. And I pray that he gives us the boldness of Esther to step forward in faith and to say, if I die, I die, but I'm going to do it. Let's answer his call to obedience. Pray with me. God, we thank you that you are so faithful. And that even when we are not enough and what we have seems insufficient to accomplish anything with, Lord, give us eyes to see and boldness to understand that you can do more than we can imagine with even little things. Lord, help us to see situations where we can make a difference. Help us not to sit back and just to hope that things change or to hope that things get better, but to step forward and to seek to make a difference with what we have. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to sing hymn number 252.